Picture this, a courtroom so silent you could hear a pin drop. Richard Rawlings, the man who built an empire on horsepower and hustle, sits slumped in his chair. His signature backward cap is gone. His rock star swagger has vanished. The judge's voice cuts through the silence like a blade. 15 years in federal prison, no parole for the first 10. And then it happens, the moment that would be replayed on every news channel for weeks. Rawlings doesn't just sit there. He doesn't accept his fate quietly. Instead, his body goes limp, and he collapses face first into the courtroom table before sliding to the floor like a broken marionette. The gasps are audible. His ex-wife covers her mouth in horror. Dennis Collins, his longtime friend and fellow car enthusiast, rushes forward but is immediately blocked by federal marshals. EMTs storm into the courtroom, their equipment clattering as they work frantically for 7 agonizing minutes. When Rawlings finally stirs, he's pale as a ghost, drenched in sweat, his eyes hollow and lifeless. The man who once commanded millions of viewers with his larger-than-life personality is now being wheeled out on a stretcher, an oxygen mask strapped to his face, looking more dead than alive. But here's what's truly shocking about this moment, and what I'm about to reveal to you in the next few minutes. This collapse wasn't just from the shock of his sentence. It was the culmination of a web of lies, so intricate, so carefully constructed, that it fooled an entire industry for nearly a decade. You see, what happened in that courtroom wasn't just the fall of a TV personality. It was the exposure of the most elaborate automotive fraud in American history. And by the time I'm done telling you this story, you'll understand exactly how one man's obsession with being the biggest, loudest, and most successful car dealer in America led him to build a criminal empire that would ultimately destroy everything he claimed to love. But before we dive into the shocking details of how Richard Rawlings allegedly turned Gas Monkey Garage into a sophisticated forgery operation, let me take you back to where it all began. Because understanding the man behind the myth is crucial to understanding how this entire house of cards came crashing down. Richard Rawlings wasn't born into the automotive world. He clawed his way into it with nothing but ambition, a silver tongue, and an uncanny ability to make people believe in his vision. Growing up in Texas, he wasn't the kid with the rich dad who bought him classic cars. He was the kid who worked at gas stations, learning every bolt, every wire, every secret that made engines roar to life. His early days were marked by small-time flips, buying broken-down vehicles, fixing them up in his garage, and selling them for a modest profit. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would suggest he'd one day become a household name. But even then, there were signs of the showmanship that would later define his career. He didn't just sell cars, he sold stories. Every vehicle had a backstory, every deal had drama, every transaction felt like an event. When Fast and Loud premiered on Discovery Channel, it wasn't just another car restoration show. It was Richard Rawlings unleashed on a national stage. With his backward cap, his Texas drawl, and his ability to turn a simple car flip into must-see television, he transformed what could have been a niche hobby show into appointment viewing for millions of Americans. The formula was intoxicating. Find a diamond in the rough, restore it with passion and expertise, then flip it for massive profit while the cameras rolled. Viewers ate it up. Here was a guy who seemed to have the golden touch, who could walk into any barn, any garage, any forgotten corner of America, and emerge with automotive gold. Gas Monkey Garage became more than a business. It became a brand, a lifestyle, a dream that millions of car enthusiasts wanted to live vicariously through their television screens. Rawlings wasn't just fixing cars. He was selling the fantasy that anyone could strike it rich in the collector car world if they just had the right eye, the right connections, and the right amount of hustle. The merchandise flew off the shelves. The spin-off shows multiplied. The international deals poured in. Richard Rawlings had achieved something that most entrepreneurs only dream of. He had turned his personality into a multi-million-dollar empire. He was invited to the biggest car shows, consulted on the most expensive restorations, and treated like royalty wherever he went in the automotive world. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn, and this is something that investigators would later piece together from thousands of hours of footage, financial records, and witness testimony. The success wasn't just changing Rawlings' bank account, it was changing him. The pressure to constantly find bigger, better, more spectacular cars for the show was immense. Discovery Channel wasn't paying him to restore ordinary vehicles. They were paying him to find unicorns, one-of-a-kind builds that would make viewers' jaws drop and keep them coming back week after week. And that pressure, according to federal prosecutors, is where the first seeds of deception were planted. Now, you might be thinking, okay, so he was under pressure to find great cars. That doesn't make him a criminal. And you'd be absolutely right if that's where the story ended. But what I'm about to show you next is how that pressure led to the creation of what federal investigators would later call the most sophisticated automotive fraud operation in American history. But first, let me tell you about the moment when everything started to unravel, because it wasn't a dramatic raid or a whistleblower coming forward. It started with something as mundane as a tax audit. And that single audit would expose a network of deception so vast that it would shock even seasoned federal investigators. Late 2023 should have been just another successful year for Richard Rawlings. Gas Monkey Garage was thriving, Fast and Loud was pulling in solid ratings, and the merchandise empire was generating millions in revenue. From the outside, everything looked perfect. But perfection, as investigators would soon discover, was exactly the problem. The IRS audit that would ultimately bring down Rawlings' empire began as routine as a dental cleaning. A few minor inconsistencies in quarterly filings, the kind of paperwork discrepancies that happen to businesses every day. The IRS agent assigned to the case probably expected to spend a few weeks reviewing documents, maybe issue a small fine for sloppy bookkeeping, and move on to the next case. But as forensic accountants began digging through Gas Monkey Garage's financial records, red flags started popping up like warning lights on a dashboard. Business expenses that didn't match the company's public operations. Luxury flights disguised as parts transportation runs. Personal vehicles listed as inventory but never actually sold. And then, the big one, offshore transactions that were never properly declared to federal authorities. At first glance, Rawlings' books looked immaculate, almost suspiciously so. Every transaction was documented, every expense was categorized, every dollar was accounted for. But that's exactly what made investigators suspicious. In their experience, legitimate businesses, especially creative ones like television production and car restoration, tend to have messier financial records. The perfect organization suggested someone was working very hard to hide something. The breakthrough came when auditors focused on a single vehicle sale, a supposedly rare restored classic that had been sold for over $400,000. The car had been featured prominently on Fast and Loud, with Rawlings describing it as a once-in-a-lifetime find with impeccable provenance. But when investigators ran the VIN number through manufacturer databases, something shocking emerged. The VIN didn't match any known production batch. In fact, it didn't match any manufacturer record at all. It was a ghost number, a digital phantom that existed only on paper. This wasn't a clerical error or a typo. VIN numbers are like automotive DNA. They're unique, traceable, and virtually impossible to fake convincingly. Finding a completely fabricated VIN was like discovering a counterfeit social security number. It suggested deliberate, sophisticated fraud. Investigators began following the money trail from that single sale, tracing wire transfers through shell companies, examining forged paperwork, and interviewing everyone involved in the transaction. What they found was a network of deception that stretched far beyond one questionable car sale. They were looking at what appeared to be a systematic operation designed to create fake automotive rarities and sell them to unsuspecting collectors around the world. The IRS immediately referred the case to the Department of Justice. What had started as a routine tax audit had uncovered evidence of wire fraud, mail fraud, conspiracy, and international money laundering. The single VIN discrepancy wasn't an isolated incident. It was a crack in the foundation that revealed an entire criminal enterprise operating beneath the surface of America's most popular car restoration show. But here's what's truly mind-blowing about this discovery, and what federal agents would later describe as the most shocking aspect of their investigation. That fake VIN wasn't just hidden in some back office filing cabinet. It was featured on national television, promoted to millions of viewers, and used to sell a car to an international collector who trusted Richard Rawlings implicitly. The question that kept investigators awake at night was simple but terrifying. If they could fake one car this convincingly, how many others were out there? And that question would lead them to make a discovery that would shake the entire automotive collecting world to its core. When federal agents executed their search warrant at Gas Monkey Garage, they expected to find evidence of financial fraud. What they discovered was something far more sinister and sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Hidden behind the gleaming showroom and the well-lit filming bays where Fast and Loud was produced was a section of the building that didn't appear on any official floor plan. The employees called it the cage, and access was restricted to Richard Rawlings and a handful of trusted associates. No cameras were allowed in this area. No film crews, no visitors, no one who wasn't directly involved in what federal prosecutors would later describe as the manufacturing of automotive lies. Inside this hidden workshop, investigators found equipment that had nothing to do with legitimate car restoration. Industrial-grade VIN stamping machines capable of creating authentic-looking vehicle identification numbers. Laser etching equipment for aging metal components to make them appear decades older than they actually were. High-end printers loaded with specialty papers designed to replicate vintage documentation from the 1960s and 1970s. But the most damning discovery was a computer workstation dedicated entirely to creating fake provenance documents. Build sheets that looked like they came straight from Detroit assembly lines. Dealer invoices that appeared to be decades old. Ownership records that traced fictional histories for vehicles that had never existed in the configurations being sold. According to testimony from former employees who would later cooperate with federal investigators, this operation had been running for at least 6 years. While Fast and Loud filmed in the public areas of Gas Monkey Garage, the real business, the business that generated the massive profits that funded Rawlings' lifestyle, was happening in the shadows. The process was diabolically clever. Rawlings and his team would acquire ordinary classic cars, often in good condition, but nothing special in terms of rarity or value. These vehicles would then be taken to the cage, where their identities would be completely reconstructed. VIN numbers would be altered or replaced entirely. Documentation would be created to support fictional histories involving celebrity ownership, limited production runs, or unique factory modifications that never actually occurred. The transformed vehicles would then be featured on Fast and Loud, where Rawlings would spin elaborate stories about their discovery and restoration. Viewers saw passionate craftsmanship and heard compelling backstories, but they were actually witnessing the final stage of an elaborate con game. The television show wasn't just entertainment, it was marketing for fraudulent merchandise. What made this operation particularly insidious was how it exploited the trust that viewers and collectors had in Richard Rawlings' expertise. His reputation as a car guy, built over years of television appearances and public events, became the foundation for a criminal enterprise. People didn't question the authenticity of vehicles he endorsed because they believed in the man behind the brand. The scale of the operation was staggering. Federal investigators identified at least 47 vehicles that had been processed through the cage over a 6-year period, with a combined fraudulent sale value exceeding $12 million. These weren't small-time scams, they were major financial crimes that crossed state and international borders. But the numbers, as shocking as they were, don't tell the full story of the human cost of Rawlings' alleged crimes. Because what investigators discovered next would reveal that this wasn't just about money. It was about the systematic betrayal of people who considered Richard Rawlings not just a celebrity, but a friend. And the story I'm about to tell you about one particular victim will show you just how personal and devastating this fraud really was. Of all the vehicles that passed through Richard Rawlings' alleged fraud operation, none would prove more damaging to his case than a 1967 Shelby GT 500 that he sold to a European collector for $1.2 million. This wasn't just another transaction. It was the crown jewel of his criminal enterprise, and its exposure would ultimately seal his fate in federal court. The story begins with Heinrich Müller, a 8-year-old German businessman who had spent decades building a collection of American muscle cars. Mueller wasn't just wealthy, he was passionate, knowledgeable, and deeply respectful of automotive history. He had followed Fast and Loud religiously, not just for entertainment, but because he genuinely admired what he believed was Rawlings' commitment to preserving automotive heritage. When Rawlings announced that he had acquired what he called the Holy Grail of muscle cars, a 1967 Shelby GT 500 with documented racing history and celebrity provenance, Mueller knew he had to have it. The car was featured prominently on Fast and Loud, with Rawlings describing its discovery in a barn in rural Texas and its meticulous restoration by the Gas Monkey team. The documentation looked impeccable. Build sheets that appeared to be original Ford paperwork, ownership records that traced the car's history through several notable collectors, racing records that showed the vehicle's competition history. Everything that a serious collector would want to verify authenticity was present and appeared legitimate. Mueller flew to Dallas personally to inspect the vehicle before purchase. He spent hours examining every detail, and Rawlings was there to answer every question, to share every story, to provide every assurance that this was indeed a genuine piece of automotive history. The two men shook hands on the deal, and Mueller wired $1.2 million to Gas Monkey Garage's account, believing he had just acquired the centerpiece of his collection. The car was shipped to Germany, where Mueller proudly displayed it in his private garage and began the process of insuring it through a European specialty broker. This is where the house of cards began to collapse. The insurance company, as part of their standard procedure for high-value vehicles, required independent authentication of the car's identity and provenance. The results were devastating. The VIN number, when traced through Ford's historical records, didn't match any known GT 500 production. The engine block, supposedly original to the car, showed casting marks that were inconsistent with 1967 Shelby specifications. Most damning of all, forensic analysis of the vehicle's frame revealed that it was actually a standard 1967 Mustang that had been extensively modified to appear to be a Shelby. Mueller's world collapsed. The car he had believed was worth $1.2 million was actually worth less than $200,000. But the financial loss, devastating as it was, paled in comparison to the emotional betrayal he felt. This wasn't just about money. It was about trust, passion, and the violation of everything he believed the collector car community represented. In a video deposition that would later be played in federal court, Mueller, visibly shaken and speaking in heavily accented English, described his relationship with Rawlings. "I believed in Richard. I watched his show, I admired his passion, I trusted his word. Now I see he was acting the whole time." Mueller's case was heartbreaking, but it was just the tip of the iceberg. Because what federal investigators discovered next would reveal that the Shelby deception wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a systematic pattern of fraud that had been operating for years, victimizing collectors around the world. And the evidence they uncovered would show that Richard Rawlings hadn't just built a business, he had built a machine designed specifically to manufacture lies and sell them to people who trusted him most. What made Richard Rawlings' alleged fraud so devastatingly effective wasn't just the quality of the forged documents or the sophistication of the VIN alterations. It was the fact that he had a television show watched by millions of people every week, giving him a platform to market his deceptions on a scale that traditional con artists could only dream of. Fast and Loud wasn't just entertainment, it was evidence. And federal prosecutors would use it as such during Rawlings' trial, playing clip after clip to demonstrate how the show served as a marketing vehicle for fraudulent merchandise. Every episode that featured one of the allegedly altered vehicles was essentially a commercial for a lie, broadcast to millions of unsuspecting viewers who had no reason to doubt what they were seeing. The prosecution's media expert, Dr. Sarah Chen, a professor of communications at Northwestern University, testified about the psychological power of television in creating trust and credibility. When viewers see someone on television week after week, they develop what we call parasocial relationships, she explained to the jury. They feel like they know this person, like they're friends. That emotional connection becomes a powerful tool for manipulation. The clips played in court were devastating in their implications. In one episode, Rawlings holds up what appears to be an original build sheet, claiming it came directly from the car's first owner. Expert testimony later revealed that this same document was actually created using templates found on the computer seized from The Cage. The paper had been artificially aged, the fonts carefully matched to period-appropriate typewriters, and the signatures forged using samples obtained from legitimate documents. In another episode, Rawlings describes finding a rare vehicle in a barn, complete with dramatic footage of the discovery. But cell phone records and GPS data presented by prosecutors showed that Rawlings had visited that location multiple times before filming, and the car had actually been purchased from a dealer in California and transported to Texas, specifically for the stage discovery scene. Perhaps most damning was an episode where Rawlings personally vouches for a vehicle's authenticity, looking directly into the camera and saying, "I'd stake my reputation on this car being 100% original." That same vehicle was later proven to have a completely fabricated VIN and forged documentation. The prosecution argued that Rawlings wasn't just staking his reputation, he was weaponizing it. The show's format played perfectly into the fraud scheme. Each episode followed a predictable pattern: discovery, restoration, and sale. Viewers became accustomed to seeing Rawlings find incredible vehicles, restore them with apparent expertise, and flip them for substantial profits. The consistent success created an aura of legitimacy that made it easier for victims to believe they were purchasing authentic pieces of automotive history. But the television show did more than just market individual vehicles. It created a mythology around Richard Rawlings himself. He wasn't just a car dealer, he was a treasure hunter, a preservationist, a man with an almost supernatural ability to find automotive gold where others saw only rust and neglect. This mythology became the foundation for a criminal enterprise that would ultimately generate millions in fraudulent revenue. The prosecution's closing argument on this point was particularly powerful. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Richard Rawlings didn't just commit fraud, he broadcast it. He turned deception into entertainment, and he made millions of Americans accomplices in their own deception. But television clips and expert testimony, compelling as they were, couldn't provide the jury with the most crucial piece of the puzzle. What was it actually like to work inside this alleged criminal operation? What did the people who built these fake cars know? And when did they know it? The answer to those questions would come from the most damaging testimony of the entire trial, the words of people who had worked alongside Richard Rawlings and witnessed the fraud firsthand. The most devastating testimony in the federal case against Richard Rawlings came not from investigators or experts, but from 3 former Gas Monkey Garage employees who had worked directly in The Cage. Their accounts, delivered under oath and corroborated by physical evidence, painted a picture of a workplace where fraud wasn't just tolerated, it was the primary business model. Marcus Thompson, a former fabricator who worked at Gas Monkey for 4 years.
I had been out that night with a buddy of mine. A couple of guys came up and got me from behind.
Was the first to take the stand. His testimony was methodical, detailed, and utterly damning. Thompson described his first day working in the restricted area of the shop, how he was told that everything he saw and did there was proprietary and covered by strict non-disclosure agreements. "At first, I thought we were just doing high-end custom work," Thompson testified. "Richard told us we were creating tribute cars, vehicles that honored the spirit of classic designs, but weren't necessarily original. But as time went on, it became clear that we weren't making tributes, we were making fakes." Thompson's job was to alter VIN plates and engine stampings to match the fictional histories being created for the vehicles. He described using acid etching to remove original numbers, precision stamping to apply new ones, and aging techniques to make the alterations appear decades old. Richard was very specific about the details, Thompson said. He would bring in reference materials, original parts from junkyards, anything we needed to make the fakes look authentic. The second witness, Jennifer Martinez, had worked as a document specialist in the operation. Her job was to create the paperwork that would support the fictional histories of the altered vehicles. She testified about using vintage paper stocks, period-appropriate typewriters, and even artificially aging techniques involving coffee stains and controlled exposure to sunlight. "We had templates for everything," Martinez explained. "Build sheets from different manufacturers, dealer invoices, registration documents, even insurance papers. Richard would give me a story about a car's history, and I would create all the documentation to support that story. We weren't restoring history, we were inventing it. But the most shocking testimony came from David Chen, a former mechanic who had worked closely with Rawlings for over 5 years. Chen described a conversation that took place after he had expressed concerns about the legality of what they were doing. I asked Richard directly if what we were doing was legal, Chen testified. He looked me right in the eye and said, "David, we're not breaking any laws. We're just giving people what they want to believe." When I pressed him about it, he got angry and told me that if I couldn't handle this part of the business, I was in the wrong game. Chen's testimony revealed that the fraud operation wasn't a recent development. It had been running for at least 6 years, with Rawlings personally overseeing every aspect of the deception. The former mechanic described detailed planning sessions where Rawlings would outline the fictional history for each vehicle, assign specific tasks to team members, and review the finished products before they were featured on television. All 3 witnesses testified that they had signed extensive non-disclosure agreements and had been told that revealing any information about the operation would result in immediate termination and potential legal action. The culture of secrecy was so pervasive that employees working in different areas of the shop were often unaware of what their colleagues were doing. The testimony from former employees was devastating, but it raised an even more troubling question. If this operation had been running for 6 years, how many victims were out there? How far had this web of deception spread? The answer, as investigators would discover, was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. This wasn't just an American crime, it was an international fraud that had victimized collectors on multiple continents. As news of Richard Rawlings' arrest spread through the international automotive collecting community, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Collectors from around the world started coming forward with suspicions about vehicles they had purchased from Gas Monkey Garage, and the scope of the alleged fraud began to reveal itself as truly global in nature. The first international victim to contact federal investigators was James Morrison, a collector from London who had purchased what he believed was a 1969 Dodge Charger RT with documented racing history. Morrison had paid $380,000 for the vehicle after seeing it featured on Fast and Loud and had it shipped to England for his private collection. When news of the federal investigation broke, Morrison had his car independently authenticated and discovered that it was actually a standard Charger that had been modified to appear to be an RT model. "I felt physically sick when I learned the truth," Morrison said in a video interview with investigators. "It wasn't just the money, though that was devastating enough. It was the realization that I had been completely fooled by someone I admired and trusted." Morrison's case opened the floodgates. Within weeks of his story becoming public, investigators were contacted by collectors from Germany, Japan, Australia, and Canada, all with similar stories of purchasing high-value vehicles from Gas Monkey Garage that turned out to be sophisticated fakes. The international scope of the fraud had serious legal implications. Wire transfers crossing international borders elevated the charges from simple fraud to international money laundering. The use of the Postal Service and international shipping companies to transport fraudulent vehicles added mail fraud charges. Each international transaction represented multiple federal crimes, and the penalties were severe. Perhaps most shocking was the discovery that Rawlings had specifically targeted international collectors because they were less likely to have access to American automotive databases and expert authentication services. The distance and cultural barriers made it more difficult for overseas buyers to verify the authenticity of their purchases, and Rawlings allegedly exploited this vulnerability systematically. Federal investigators worked with Interpol and law enforcement agencies in multiple countries to track down victims and gather evidence. The international cooperation was unprecedented for an automotive fraud case, reflecting the serious nature of the crimes and their global impact. One of the most heartbreaking cases involved Hiroshi Tanaka, a Japanese collector who had spent his life savings, nearly $500,000, to purchase what he believed was a 1970 Plymouth Cuda with factory racing modifications. Tanaka had been a fan of American muscle cars since childhood and had dreamed of owning an authentic piece of automotive history. When he discovered that his prized possession was actually a standard Cuda with fabricated documentation, He was devastated. In Japan, we have a concept called shinaisis. Businesses that have been trusted for generations, Tanaka explained through a translator. I believed Gas Monkey Garage was such a business. To learn that this trust was betrayed is more painful than the financial loss. The international victim stories shared common themes. Admiration for Rawlings, based on his television persona, trust in his expertise, and devastating betrayal when the truth was revealed. Many described feeling not just financially victimized, but emotionally violated by someone they had considered a friend through their television screens. The international scope of the fraud was staggering, but it raised an even more troubling question for the automotive collecting world. If Richard Rawlings could fool so many experts and enthusiasts for so long, how many other fraudulent vehicles were circulating in the market? The answer would trigger the largest authentication crisis in the history of classic car collecting, with repercussions that are still being felt today. The conviction of Richard Rawlings sent shockwaves through the automotive collecting world that extended far beyond the immediate victims of his alleged crimes. Within hours of the verdict, the entire classic car industry was in crisis mode, grappling with questions about authentication, trust, and the integrity of the market itself. Barrett-Jackson, one of the world's most prestigious automotive auction houses, was the first to respond. CEO Craig Jackson issued an emergency statement announcing that the company would immediately halt the sale of any vehicle with any connection to Gas Monkey Garage and would conduct a comprehensive review of all vehicles previously sold through Rawlings' operation. The integrity of our auctions is paramount, Jackson's statement read. We are taking immediate action to ensure that our customers can bid with complete confidence in the authenticity of every vehicle we offer. But Barrett-Jackson's response was just the beginning. Within 48 hours, every major auction house in the world had issued similar statements. Meckham Auctions, R.M. Sotheby's, Bonhams, and dozens of smaller regional auction companies all announced immediate investigations into any vehicles connected to Gas Monkey Garage. The financial implications were staggering. Vehicles that had been considered blue-chip investments were suddenly under suspicion. Private collectors who had purchased cars through Gas Monkey Garage saw their collections' values plummet overnight. Insurance companies began freezing claims and demanding re-authentication of high-value policies. The crisis extended beyond just Gas Monkey-related vehicles. The Rawlings case had exposed fundamental weaknesses in the authentication systems that the entire industry relied upon. If sophisticated fakes could fool experts, television producers, and seasoned collectors for years, how many other fraudulent vehicles were circulating in the market? Dr. Michael Harrison, a forensic automotive expert who had testified in the Rawlings trial, estimated that the case would trigger authentication reviews of thousands of vehicles worldwide. This isn't just about Gas Monkey Garage, Harrison explained in an interview with Automotive News. This case has revealed that our entire system for verifying automotive authenticity needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. The psychological impact on collectors was perhaps even more significant than the financial damage. The classic car community had always prided itself on expertise, passion, and mutual trust. The revelation that one of their most visible and trusted members had allegedly been systematically defrauding them for years shattered that sense of security. Online forums and collector groups were flooded with posts from enthusiasts questioning the authenticity of their own vehicles. Many described feeling paranoid about purchases they had made years earlier, wondering if they too had been victims of fraud. The sense of community that had defined the hobby for decades was replaced by suspicion and doubt. The legal ramifications were equally complex. Class action lawsuits were filed against Discovery Channel, alleging that the network had failed to properly vet the authenticity of vehicles featured on Fast and Loud. Insurance companies began denying claims related to Gas Monkey vehicles, leading to additional litigation. The legal battles would continue for years, with millions of dollars in damages still being calculated. Perhaps most tragically, several smaller restoration shops and dealers who had worked with Gas Monkey Garage found themselves under suspicion, despite having no involvement in the alleged fraud. The guilt by association destroyed businesses and reputations that had taken decades to build. The industry-wide crisis was devastating, but it all led back to one man sitting in a federal courtroom, facing the consequences of his alleged actions. The moment when Richard Rawlings would finally be held accountable for the chaos he had allegedly created was approaching, and nobody, not even his closest associates, was prepared for how it would unfold. The trial of Richard Rawlings lasted 3 weeks, but the jury needed only 6 hours to reach their verdict. As the 12 men and women filed back into the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Rawlings sat at the defendant's table, flanked by his legal team, his usual swagger replaced by a hollow, defeated expression. The foreman stood and delivered the verdict that would end an era, guilty on all 18 counts. Wire fraud, mail fraud, tax evasion, conspiracy, money laundering, every charge the prosecution had brought was sustained by the evidence. The courtroom was silent except for the quiet sobbing of Rawlings' ex-wife, who had attended every day of the trial despite their acrimonious divorce. But the real drama was yet to come. Judge Alanir Simmons, a veteran of the federal bench known for his measured demeanor and carefully considered sentences, took his time before addressing the defendant. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of justice long delayed. "Mr. Rawlings," Judge Simmons began, "you have been convicted of crimes that go far beyond simple fraud. You have systematically betrayed the trust of people who admired you, who believed in you, who considered you a friend through their television screens. You have damaged not just individual victims, but an entire industry and community." The judge continued, outlining the scope of the crimes and their impact on victims around the world. He spoke about Heinrich Müller, the German collector who had lost his life savings. He mentioned the small restoration shops that had been destroyed by association with Gas Monkey Garage. He addressed the broader damage to the classic car community's sense of trust and security. "The sentence I am about to impose reflects not just the financial damage you have caused, but the human cost of your actions." Judge Simmons said, 15 years in federal prison, with no possibility of parole for the first 10 years. The words hit Rawlings like a physical blow. For a moment, he sat perfectly still, as if processing what he had just heard. Then, without warning, his body went limp. He pitched forward, his face striking the defendant's table with a sickening thud before his unconscious form slid to the floor. The courtroom erupted in gasps and shouts. His ex-wife screamed his name. Dennis Collins, who had been sitting in the gallery, tried to rush forward but was immediately restrained by federal marshals. Court security called for medical assistance as Rawlings lay motionless on the courtroom floor. EMTs arrived within minutes, working frantically to revive the fallen television star. For 7 agonizing minutes, they administered oxygen and checked vital signs while the courtroom watched in stunned silence. When Rawlings finally regained consciousness, he was pale, sweating, and barely coherent. Instead of being led away in handcuffs as everyone expected, Richard Rawlings was wheeled out of the courtroom on a stretcher, an oxygen mask covering his face, his eyes vacant and lifeless. The man who had once commanded television screens with his larger-than-life personality was now a broken shell of his former self. The image of Rawlings being wheeled away would become iconic, a symbol of how far and how fast someone can fall when their empire is built on lies. But the story doesn't end with Richard Rawlings being wheeled out of that courtroom, because the impact of his alleged crimes continues to reverberate through the automotive world today, changing how we think about authenticity, trust, and the very nature of collecting itself. In the months following Richard Rawlings' conviction and dramatic collapse in federal court, the automotive world struggled to come to terms with the magnitude of what had been revealed. The man who had been a hero to millions of car enthusiasts was now serving time in federal prison, and the industry he had helped popularize was left to pick up the pieces. Discovery Channel moved quickly to distance itself from the scandal. Within 72 hours of the verdict, all episodes of Fast and Loud were removed from streaming platforms and the network's archives. Spin-off shows were canceled, merchandise was pulled from shelves, and any mention of Gas Monkey Garage was scrubbed from Discovery's promotional materials. The network issued a carefully worded statement expressing shock at the revelations and emphasizing their commitment to content integrity. But the damage extended far beyond one television show. The Rawlings case had exposed fundamental flaws in how the classic car industry authenticated vehicles and verified their histories. In response, major auction houses began implementing new verification procedures, including mandatory third-party authentication for high-value vehicles and blockchain-based provenance tracking systems. The legal aftermath was equally complex and far-reaching. Class action lawsuits were filed on behalf of victims around the world, seeking damages not just from Rawlings personally, but from Discovery Channel, Gas Monkey Garage's corporate entities, and even some of the auction houses that had sold the fraudulent vehicles. The litigation would continue for years, with settlements eventually reaching into the hundreds of millions of dollars. Perhaps most significantly, the case led to new federal legislation, specifically targeting automotive fraud. The Classic Car Authentication Act, passed by Congress in 2024, established federal standards for vehicle authentication and created severe penalties for VIN tampering and document forgery. The law was informally known as the Rawlings Act, ensuring that his name would be forever associated with the crimes that brought down his empire. For the victims, the aftermath was a mixture of vindication and ongoing pain. Heinrich Müller, the German collector who had lost over $1 million, eventually recovered a portion of his losses through the class action settlement, but he never bought another classic car. "The joy is gone," he said in a final interview. "How can you trust again when someone you admired so much could lie so completely?" The broader classic car community also struggled with trust issues. Online forums that had once been filled with enthusiastic discussions about fines and restorations became dominated by authentication concerns and fraud warnings. The sense of camaraderie that had defined the hobby was replaced by suspicion and paranoia. Yet in some ways, the industry emerged stronger from the crisis. The new authentication standards, while expensive and time-consuming, gave collectors greater confidence in their purchases. The increased scrutiny made it much more difficult for fraudsters to operate, and the severe penalties established by the Rawlings Act served as a powerful deterrent. As for Richard Rawlings himself, he remains in federal prison, serving his 15-year sentence. Reports from those who have visited him describe a broken man, a shadow of the charismatic television personality who once commanded millions of viewers. He has reportedly expressed remorse for his actions, but the damage to his victims and to the industry he once claimed to love cannot be undone. The Gas Monkey Garage building in Dallas now sits empty, a monument to how quickly an empire built on lies can crumble. The sign has been removed, the equipment sold at auction, and the infamous cage where the fraudulent vehicles were created has been demolished. In the end, Richard Rawlings' story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked ambition and the corrosive effects of deception. He had everything: fame, fortune, the admiration of millions, but it wasn't enough. His need to be the biggest, the best, the most successful ultimately led him to betray everything he claimed to stand for. The automotive collecting world continues to heal from the wounds inflicted by the Gas Monkey scandal, but the scars remain. Trust, once broken, is not easily repaired. And the name Richard Rawlings, once synonymous with automotive passion and expertise, will forever be remembered as a cautionary tale about the price of building an empire on lies. The roar of engines that once filled Gas Monkey Garage has been replaced by silence. The cameras that once captured automotive dreams now capture only empty spaces. And the man who once promised to turn rust into gold sits behind bars, serving as a reminder that in the end, the truth always comes out. The Richard Rawlings scandal changed everything. How we authenticate vehicles, how we verify sellers, how we trust our heroes. It was the end of an era of blind faith in automotive celebrities and the beginning of a new age of verification and accountability. And perhaps, in the long run, that's exactly what the classic car community needed.